Hello class, so today we're continuing our study of feminism by way of a Canadian philosopher. She's alive today. Her name is Catherine J. Norlock. She teaches at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. And so she wrote this paper titled Building Receptivity, Leopold's Land Ethic, and Critical Feminist Interpretation. So in other words, we're blending Leopold's land ethic also with ethics of care by way of Nell Noddings, okay? So this is a fusion of environmental ethics along with what we would call feminism, otherwise known as ethics of care, okay? So let's recognize that this is the simultaneously an introduction to feminist ethics of care, so with a focus on Nell Noddings. So she was a key philosopher in what's called the ethics of care. So she's the developer of what we term ethics of care. And so this is also a way to introduce the work of Aldo Leopold as well. So he's a key philosopher in environmental ethics. And so we don't need to read all 19 pages of the PDF, just pages 491 to 499, okay? So although Norlock's, one of Norlock's initial points has to do with accessing other feminist literature relating to Leopold, we don't necessarily want to focus on these points. We just want to focus on the points of the essay where we're understanding the confluence of Leopold with Noddings' ethics of care in terms of receptivity, affection, and relationships. So the importance of receptivity, affection, and relationships for Noddings in relation to Aldo Leopold. So Aldo Leopold wrote a Sand County Almanac, which wasn't published till 1949. So this is about the area known as Sand County in Wisconsin, where he lived in the 30s and 40s. So you'll find references to the 30s and 40s in her quotes, but remember that the book wasn't published till his death in 1949. So to be clear, Aldo Leopold is well known for what is termed the land ethic, and we'll look a little more at that later. So we should see that Norlock's quotes of Leopold as all of his overall land ethic, including Norlock's focus on perceptivity and receptivity in his Sound County Almanac. What we're looking at is how this connects to ethics of care, obviously. So in other words, for ethics of care, we start with this idea that of Leopold's that there's a disconnect between the way in which we see the land as something that is here to consume rather than as a place to enhance our perception and to elicit our receptivity, our intuitive, affective receptivity into our understanding of the land as well. So even though, as Norlock quotes Leopold from an ecological perspective, quote, that situation is hopeless, the situation, our ecological situation is hopeless, this should not prevent us on doing our best to start figuring out ways to access how we understand ecology in new and innovative ways, right? Because we know that perhaps traditional ways aren't always getting us there in the ways that we want to, right? So while at the same time, Leopold encourages us to have an appreciation of the complexities, a quote, appreciation of complexities that exceed what it may be possible to focus or to apprehend, right? So, in other words, unquote. So, I like the reference to to the de-emphasis on purely factual information as a way to overemphasize the role of scientific technology as an easy solution to our ecological woes, right? So obviously Leopold is critical of a consumerized approach to solving ecological problems, as with the idea that the land is merely there as instrumental to our needs, right? So, in other words, that the land is there to be consumed and dominated rather than being receptive to our place in the biota of the environment, right? So Leopold wanted us to foster this receptivity as building and fostering curiosity about the land and its context with the whole biosphere, okay? So yet, people have to want to be curious. We can't knock someone over the head to convince them to be more ecologically curious, right? So about what the land is, about how the land is understood. So we have to recognize our own conscience from within. So essentially, people have to want to care. We cannot force anyone to care about the land, right? Caring about the land is not waiting for the experts to come in and to decide what to do. It's about our own conscientious responsibility to do so, right? So, in other words, we have to want to be conscientious in the first place. We have to care enough to be conscientious in the first place. So, caring is never simply about this idea that there's something to be measured or about data collection, right? That thinking about the land is just about quantification for evaluation in terms of cost and monetary value, right? So even if we understand the land in terms of a scientific evaluation or in terms of profit and loss, or in terms of simply what the land gives us, we're still missing the emotional heart of the land, right? Knowing receptively and emotionally, so how it is that we're understanding the land, right? So even understanding the land intellectually is not enough. What we're aiming for, that's usually what's not accounted for, and that's receptivity and perceptual attunement, right? Or perceptual attuning. So by way of care. So we're attuning ourselves perceptually and effectively in the way in which we're developing our conscientiousness as a means of caring, right? So her Norlack then has the subchapter Caring and Leopold's Receptivity, Caring and Nodding and Leopold's Receptivity. So that starts on page 496. So we already recognize that Leopold's land ethic bears a profound affinity to the feminist of care ethics in terms of prioritization of affect or emotion, receptivity, relationships with others, and the environment, right? So here we recognize a fundamental feature of Nodding's ethics of care as relational, okay? So in other words, namely, of course, about caring relationships. So then the answer is yes, we should care for others in terms of obligation and care. So this relational sphere should also include relational care in terms of more animals and the natural world. So with Noddings, we find a key word that ties into a sense of the relational in terms of engrossment. So this could be thought of as a deep engagement or even a caring immersion into the way that we're understanding our relationships with people, likewise our relationships with animals, and our relationships with the environment, right? So in other words, Nell Noddings is the developer of what we now term ethics of care, and so that is a corollary to feminist ethics. So in other words, she wrote a book back in 1985 titled Caring, a Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education. So this was inspired by a work a few years earlier by the feminist Carol Gilligan. And so Gilligan's feminist approach to ethics served as a moral critique of traditional male-based ethical theory, whereby such a, she was critical of this neutral justice perspective that deprioritizes emotion and care, right? So in other words, our affective disposition is downgraded and ignored, right? So so yes, such ideals as neutrality and justice are still important, yet caring and emotion are usually left out of our ethical appraisals, right? So in other words, oftentimes we're thinking in order to clarify our ethical position, we need to extract our emotion from the way in which we understand ethics. Feminist ethics with Carol Gilligan and likewise with Nell Noddings, and then extending on into Aldo Leopold, also get us to start thinking of how our affective, our emotional lives also play a part in how it is that we care. And I just thought about it too. It might be worth it to clarify that Aldo Leopold is not a feminist, okay? So he was an ethicist in terms of ecology, so an ecological ethicist, but he was not a feminist outright. So in other words, Norlock is really just finding an affinity here to point out as far as our connection to environmental ethics, okay? So we need to be clear there. And then also, so for Noddings, what is of critical importance then is not just caring, but a focus on the cared for, right? So in that sense, we need to see that caring is reciprocal, it's interactive, it's a so-called active virtue for Noddings. So, quote, we act on the behalf of others because we want to do so. So acting in accord with natural caring, unquote. So in other words, the way in which we're thinking of caring is also a two-way street, right? So in other words, if we don't care about those around us, we'll see that reflected back to us in terms of how others treat us. Likewise, that relationship is also part of how we're understanding our interaction with the natural environment. So if we don't care about the natural environment, that's reflected in the way the natural environment is experienced by us as well, okay? So when we act in a community of others, we do so because we care about our relationships, right? So most importantly, we have the term receptivity, right? So a way of slowing down. So receptivity has to do with a way of slowing down to receive the place, to receive the environment, to hear someone else, to care for something else or someone else, is to care that is receptive, right? So it's receptive to who they are, to what we're experiencing, to where we are, right? So in other words, it's not just about domination or ownership or accessing something in terms of an intellectual engagement, right? So in other words, objectivity is nothing without relationships. So we still need to be in a relational way with others, animals, non-sentient beings, and likewise extending on into nature. So studying morality includes fostering a feeling for things, right? So to be sure, the culmination of receptivity is brought about not as a part of achieving happiness for noddings, as Norlick indicates. Rather, receptivity is brought about to cultivate a deeper awareness of problems and subtleties in the environment that are missed, right? So even if we think about that in terms of people, right? That in other words, if you're not listening to the people that you supposedly care for, then you're actually not caring for them as effectively as you can be, right? So in other words, listening and being receptive is what we're looking at in terms of a basis for not only ethics of care, but also the way in which we're understanding Aldo Leopold's land ethic, right? So in other words, if we're always in this neutral standpoint, as the traditionalists would have us be, even from an environmental standpoint, and even basically just from a rational vantage, we're not receptive enough, right? So always remember that feminism and ethics of care are showing us what traditional ethics leaves behind, right? So in other words, this isn't about female domination. This is about understanding what it is that traditional ethics leaves behind, what traditional ethics ignores. So in other words, what we're ignoring is our own receptivity to how it is that we could start focusing in on our understanding of the problems, and likewise, how it is that we could enjoy our environment in terms of play and recreation, not just as something to be consumed, okay? So I think that's a good place to stop, and we'll talk more about this later. Thank you, class.